So you spawned your Bristlenose Pleco. Now what? In today's video, we're going to talk about the proper care of eggs once your Bristlenose Pleco has spawned. The first and most important thing that you should do whenever you notice your male Bristlenose Pleco is fanning in a cave on a new fresh clutch of eggs is simply chill out and take a deep breath. One of the biggest mistakes you can make whenever your Bristlenose Pleco spawns is to rush things. Take your time, because if you get too excited, you can stress out the male and he could eat the eggs. It's happened to me before. Now that brings up a good question. Whenever my Bristlenose Pleco spawns, should I pull the eggs or should I just leave the eggs in the cave and let dad do the job of parenting? I've done both ways, but 90% of the time, I pull the eggs. Pulling the eggs is easy once you've done it a few times and you get the hang of it. It's a breeze. One thing you should do before you pull the eggs is you need to make sure the eggs are fertilized. If you're like me and you observe your Plecos all the time, you're gonna already know that the Plecos are gonna spawn before they've even spawned. And you should know that there was plenty of time for the male to get in and fertilize the eggs. Before you pull the eggs out, you're gonna wanna get everything set up. You're gonna wanna grab a breeder box and you're gonna wanna grab an air stone and some airline. And you're gonna wanna set it up on a tank that has pretty close to the same parameters and temperature as the parent's tank. As a rule of thumb, I always do that and it works out great for me. When it comes to breeder boxes, I like the ones that are air driven over the ones that pump the water in. That way I can regulate the flow that comes in to just a drip. And I also like to put a regulator on the airline that goes to the air stone so I can regulate that as well, because you don't want it blowing the eggs away. You just want it tumbling them enough to keep all the waste off of them so they don't get fungused. And that's something that we'll talk about later, because fungus is a big issue when it comes to pulling eggs. All right, now it's time to pull the eggs. The first thing you want to do is be calm. If you stress out, you're going to stress out the male. Sometimes when you pull the cave out of the tank, the male will come out on his own, but other times you have to pull them out. I like to use those aquascaping tweezers that have the curve to them. You can reach up over his body and pull his fins back, because the way that the fins are located and the way that they come back towards the back of the body, they can really get lodged up in that cave really good. If all else fails, put him and the cave in the breeder box until you can see him come out, and then you can take the eggs out at that time. Now that you've got the male out of the cave, I always use a butter knife. You just grasp the cave in one hand and hold it under a light and look down in there and use the butter knife to scrape the eggs off until you get them to break free, and then dump them in your breeder box. Now that this is done, you have to battle your biggest problem whenever it comes to pulling eggs, and that's fungus. There's tons of different ways to battle this, but the way that I do it is I put a couple of Neocaridina shrimp in there with the eggs. They like to clean the eggs non-stop. They're always on them. They're cleaning off all the waste and making for sure that the eggs are completely clean. And I also use an air stone to combat with that as well. An air stone creates flow in the tank and it helps push waste past the eggs and keeps it away from them. And that's something that you've got to check on daily, because once fungus starts on one egg, it spreads to the other eggs like wildfire, and before you know it, you can lose the whole clutch of eggs. Now in 3 or 4 days, or a little longer in some cases, your eggs are going to turn to wigglers. That brings up another question. How long do you leave the baby Plecos in the breeder box? I've tried it a ton of different ways, and I've found that if I leave them in there until they're at least 3/4 of an inch to an inch long, they tend to do a lot better. By this time, they've got tons of mulm built up in the breeder box, and they're doing really good. Hopefully you guys were able to get a little bit of something out of this to be able to do this on your own. I know that there's different schools of thought on this. Some people leave them in the cave and let the dad do the parenting, and others like myself, like to pull the eggs. The biggest reason why I like to pull the eggs is I don't want a bunch of babies flying around in a great big giant tank, because they're really hard to capture whenever they're that age, and in order for me to ever get rid of them, I'm gonna have to do so.